Welcome to another edition of Boxing Info. I'm your host, The Islander, and this is another special edition. It's called This Day in Boxing, November the 13th, 1982, the day that I believe changed boxing forever. As you all know, I did a video yesterday about the WBA Junior Welterweight Championship between Aaron Pryor and Alexis Arguello. Less than 24 hours after that happened in Miami, CBS, on their normal Sports Saturday, on November 13th, televised the WBA Lightweight Championship of the World, the second title defense of Ray Boom Boom Mancini against number one WBA contender Deuk Kim. And as you all also know, on my channel, there's a documentary uploaded about the 25th anniversary of when that happened. And I can't believe that's already been 10 years ago, because today is the 35th anniversary of when this happened. And let's put it this way. Again, a lot of you know that I'm kind of, I don't know if you call it bitter or just disenchanted about the way boxing has become, because when I talk about things like this and yesterday's video, that's when boxing was at its best. And with this said, the fight took place outdoors at Caesar's Palace on a Saturday afternoon. There is some backstory to this of whether or not Deuk Kim should have even been fighting in the fight, or what had happened, all kinds of voodoo about him predicting he was either going to kill or be killed and all this other kind of stuff. I'm not going to pour into that. What I do know is that it's very rare in boxing that you have an exciting style like Mancini, basically mostly all offense and very little regard for defense, which, I mean, he tried his best with his ability, that you get matched with somebody of equal, almost like a mirror image. They were almost like a mirror image of each other. I'm talking about Deuk Kim, because Ray Mancini was a natural left-hander like Oscar De La Hoya, who was turned around the fight conventionally and get his power hand closer to his opponent. The Deuk Kim was a lefty who fought out of the southpaw stance. Now, the situation is that Deuk Kim had never fought in the United States before, but he was the WBA's number one contender. Back in those days, from the 70s into the 80s, when there were only two sanctioning organizations, the WBA and the WBC, each of those organizations are paid by each nation to rank their fighters. Now, those organizations cater to certain nationalities, or they did back then, more heavily than they do now. And you might notice back then that most of the boxers who had a WBC title were either American or British, meaning English or Scottish, and Mexican mostly. It was very rare that you saw a Mexican fighter fighting for a WBA title or being a WBA. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it was very rare. And at that time, the same thing, with, I would say, a lot of the British fighters, like at the flyweight limit, you had Charlie Magri, fighting for and winning the WBC title. And I'm trying to think of, but in any event, these organizations were created to cater to nationals that were thought of being looked over or discriminated against. So Korea, at that time, was very much aligned with the WBA. And there's some backstory behind this, was whether or not Deuk Kim was here because a fight between middleweight champion, undisputed middleweight champion, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, and a contender they had ranked in the top three named Chong Pao Park, who I think, if I may be, don't hold me to this, it is coming from memory, but I'm pretty sure they wanted to match him with Marvin Hagler, and he had possibly more notable wins on his record, but the TV networks, HBO, who Marvin Hagler fought on, would not buy a fight between Hagler and Chong Pao Park. So somehow a deal was done where they, I guess, financed a fight between Mancini and Deuk Kim, in which they brought Deuk Kim over here, because there was no way in hell that either Hagler or Mancini were going to go over to Korea to defend their titles, when the purse bids, if it was brought to purse bid, was always going to be won out by the United States anyway. And some of what I'm telling you is speculative, based on things and issues that have happened before that fight and after that fight. So here we are on November 13th, a Saturday, beautiful sunny day. I remember it being, at least in on Long Island as well as Las Vegas. It was probably frigid cold on Long Island at that time. And Ray Mancini's defending his title for the second time against this unknown Deuk Kim. To give you a little bit of background, Mancini was a household name, well known all throughout the United States in boxing circles, and he had failed in his first attempt at the title against Alexis Arguello, quickly rebounded within 8 months of losing that title bid to win the WBA version of the title from Art Frias in a hellacious one-round battle in which he stopped Art Frias in the first round. His first title defense, I'm trying to think of, that was in May of '82 when he beat Art Frias, and his first title defense was in July of 1982 at a football stadium in a high school in Warren, Ohio, against Ernesto Espana, the former champion, who I thought had a serious chance of being able to beat Mancini. He was tall, he was experienced, but Mancini's overwhelming pressure and strength just overwhelmed him. So what were the expectations coming into the fight between Mancini and Deuk Kim? For us novice people, again, I was 12 years old, we expected a fight that would go no longer than 8 or 10 rounds probably. I expected Ernesto Espana to take Mancini into deep waters, and he couldn't hold him off. So the expectations here was that Deuk Kim might present some challenges, but the fight would be over somewhere between the eighth and 10th rounds. Well, when the fight started, and those of you who want to look this up, it's prevalent on the internet. Deuk Kim met Mancini head on, and like one of his handlers said in the 25-year anniversary video, it's on my channel, that it was like two battering rams going at each other. And much to my surprise, Deuk Kim took everything Mancini gave and dished it back in spades. And I'm going to be honest with you, there were times when I was watching this fight thinking, this guy is keeping this up, meaning Deuk Kim, he might win the fight. I mean, it was very conceivable that Mancini might suffer a terrible cut to his eyes and they'd have to stop the fight, or that the pace would keep up for the whole 15 rounds and the judges might see it for Kim, because at certain points in the fight, Kim looked like he was getting the better of the exchanges. Mancini was doing a lot of body work that went undetected. The same kind of body work that Arguello could have used the night before. And if I'm being totally honest with myself, I actually feared that Kim was going to actually win the fight. And, after 10 rounds, much like with Mancini's fight against Alexis Arguello, the fight was dead even. If you had Kim ahead, I wouldn't blame you. If you had Mancini ahead, I wouldn't blame you. And then inching into the championship rounds, there was a point, I believe it was in the 11th round, where they were in the middle of an exchange, and I thought Mancini caught Kim either with a body shot and then a right uppercut to the head, and he went to one knee and got right back up. And because the pace was so frantic, Richard Green, the referee, didn't have a chance to break them apart and rule it a knockdown, which it truly was a knockdown. Not a hard knockdown, but one that would have gotten the audience at home, the audience there, and both camps to understand that Mancini had finally got an upper hand on Kim. And I will say that after the 10th round, Mancini started to very, very slowly and almost like indiscreetly, you couldn't tell this with the naked eye watching it live, only watching it back in retrospect could you really see this, that Mancini was starting to separate himself from Kim a little bit, because large swaths of the 11th, 12th, and 13th rounds were dominated by Mancini. Kim would come back. I mean, it wasn't like he was getting rolled over, but he'd come back. But larger parts of the round were being dominated by Mancini. And the damage that they did to each other with just a bruising, it wasn't like they were hitting each other on the point of the chin every time. It was off the side of the head. It was off the shoulders. It was off the body. It was just one of the greatest competitive fights of all time. We are lucky to see anything remotely close to this these days. And going into the 13th round, as Mancini's, who was built for fighting 15 rounds, his engine started inching up and revving up. He opened up the 13th round trying to get rid of Kim with a barrage of 30-something unanswered punches. If the referee was going to stop the fight for any reason, it was then. The only problem was is that Kim was defending himself, ducking, trying to block punches. Not all of them were landing, and then was firing back. And by the end of the round, he had basically leveled the playing field. I'd still score that round for Mancini, but Kim had shown I'm still here in the fight. And I think that's really where the last hurrah was, because what ended up happening, I think, to Deuk Kim, I believe, happened over the course of the entire fight, not at one particular point. And in the 14th round, as most of you know, they both came out and met, and Mancini unleashed a 4-punch combination, of which 2.5 of the punches landed. A left, a right uppercut, a left hook that glanced off Kim's head, and a straight right hand that put him down flat on his back. Only 15 seconds into the 14th round. Everybody who's watching the fight knew the fight was going to be over very shortly after that. Now, Kim, to his credit, was badly hurt and climbed to his feet, holding on to one of the ropes almost like in a semi-crouching position with one hand on the ropes. And the referee correctly waved the fight off at that point. You know, to us watching the fight, it was one of the greatest spectacles of prize fighting you'd ever seen. Both from a challenge and a champion standpoint of how two people really wanted this title. This was not about money. This was not about pay-per-view revenue. This was on regular network TV. And as you know, Kim quickly collapsed. The reports I read in Sports Illustrated immediately after this fight was that Deuk Kim was taking less than 4 breaths a minute when he was basically being carried off on the stretcher. He was only taking 4 breaths a minute. He had lost consciousness, never regained it, was carted off to the hospital. As a 12-year-old, not knowing that at the time, I was saying to my parents, like, something's not right with him. If somebody who's climbed off the canvas and then all of a sudden collapsed, that I never saw that before happen, and knew something was wrong. You know, the people like Sugar Ray Leonard, who was calling the fight, and, you know, people who were there ringside thought maybe he was dehydrated, something like that. That's what we were hoping was wrong, but they carried him onto the ambulance, and it wasn't. I don't remember if the 11 o'clock news in New York had this on or not, but it was less than 24 hours later that we knew that something was wrong with him and that he was basically in big trouble. With all the news that surfaced upon this in the days that followed, were that obviously he had brain trauma and had, like, from what I remember reading, a 250 or 230 cc blood clot wedged in between his brain and his skull that had to be removed or drained, that was putting severe pressure on his brain. Medical technology at that time was advanced for the Western world. It wasn't what it was today. And my belief in watching this and watching it back was that this capillary that broke in Deuk Kim's brain happened sometime in the middle of the fight. It didn't happen from one single punch. It didn't happen from his head hitting the bottom rope when he went down or hitting the canvas. His head didn't hit the bottom rope, but hitting the canvas. It happened sometime throughout the fight, and the leak in that capillary slowly became a 230. I don't know how big 230 cc's is, but it was significant enough clot to put pressure on his brain to cause him to never regain consciousness again and basically lapse into a brain dead status. His mother was brought over from South Korea, as most of you know, and they pulled the plug on the life support systems in Las Vegas 4 days later. Now, the fallout from this is still haunting us today. I know from the documentary that Ray Mancini starts feeling ill and melancholy when this time of year comes around. I need to tell you that in the 35 years that has passed since this, there's not a November that comes around like today that I don't think about this. Because this man who fought so valiantly for this title and lost deserved better than this, and more importantly, we, as the consumers, deserve better than what has happened as a result of this. Immediately following this tragedy, all of the organizations got together, all of the know-it-alls got together, and decided that the reason this happened was because he was being beaten on for too long of a time. Never mind that he was given as much as he was taking. And that the WBC, whose title was not even at stake at this time, decided to shorten their title fights starting in January of 1983, less than 2 months later, from 15 rounds to 12 rounds. Now, let me be clear about this. Conveniently enough, a 12-round fight, which is 12 3-minute rounds, makes 36 minutes, with 1 minute of rest in between each round, which is another 12 minutes, turns out to be 48 minutes, fits very nicely into a 1-hour network TV slot, whereas a 15-round fight is obviously 45 minutes, plus the 15 minutes of rest period, which is 60 minutes plus pre-fight and post-fight. And the networks could fit, that was real messy for the networks. I'll get into more of that in a second. But more importantly, in all of the high-profile ring deaths that happened up to this point, most notably the Sugar Ray Robinson, was it Jimmy Doyle, fight in defense of his welterweight title, where Sugar Ray Robinson had basically had a dream that something bad happened to him. That was a 15-round title fight, and the knockout occurred in the 8th round. So reducing the fights from 15 to 12 rounds wouldn't have saved his life. And I say that, in the most sincere, most sincere empathy towards him losing his life over his profession. Fast forward a couple of decades to the World Welterweight Championship, rubber match between champion Benny Kid Paret of Cuba and Emil Griffith of the Virgin Islands in New York, in which, again, the fight was scheduled for 15 rounds. A little bit of a backstory that most people don't know about that fight is that Benny Kid Paret made some type of a homosexual slur towards Emil Griffith before the fight and really enraged him, because I think Emil Griffith worked in a ladies' hat factory or something like that by day, and he was a fighter by night. Most people had second jobs or 2 jobs back then who were professional athletes. And Emil Griffith unleashed a ferocious beating on Benny Kid Paret, in which he was caught up in the ropes, and the referee should have stopped the fight before he did, and he was basically being pummeled, his unprotected head, while he was hung up in the ropes. And this was on national TV as well, and this happened in the 12th round. So, again, another 15-round fight that if it was reduced to 12 rounds, Benny Kid Paret still would have suffered the same awful fate that he suffered. And since the WBC decided to take the first steps of safety and make December of 1982 the last time that they would sanction 15-round title fights, less than 9 months, or I should say 10 months after the Mancini-Kim fight, Lupe Pintor, the WBC bantamweight champion, that's another one I forgot. Basically in 1980, the WBC bantamweight champion, Lupe Pintor, Mexico, brought over Johnny Owen from Wales, who was a very able and capable fighter who had been, I think, the 15-round distance in British Commonwealth title fights. He basically put up a gallant effort, very similar to Deuk Kim, and that fight probably could have been stopped a little bit earlier by either the referee or his family. Basically was knocked out in the 12th round viciously and never regained consciousness as well. He suffered another brain injury that caused him to die. Again, this was a scheduled 15-round fight. The knockout came in the 12th round. So shortening the fights from 15 to 12 rounds would not have saved any of them, and it may not have saved Deuk Kim. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on TV. I don't pretend to be one. So we fast forward to September of 1983 now, and Lupe Pintor, the aforementioned survivor of a bout with Johnny Owen, has vacated his title after unsuccessfully trying for Wilfredo Gomez's WBC Super Bantamweight title 2 or 3 weeks after this fight on November 13th, 1982. His vacant title was going to be contested in Los Angeles in September of 1983 by 4-time challenger Albert Davila of California and up-and-coming prospect Jesus Kiko Bejinas of Mexico, who was a slight favorite in this fight. He was the youth. He was expected to be a world champion. He came from fighting brothers, Oscar, and there was another one. I don't remember. None of them ever became world champions, but he came from a fighting family. He was expected to win this fight. And through 11 rounds of this fight in Los Angeles for the vacant WBC bantamweight title, scheduled 12-round fight. The WBA is still 15 rounds. The IBF, which was going to be born quickly after this, was 15 rounds. Bejinas was ahead on the scorecards. All he had to do was stand up for the 12th round, and he'd be bantamweight champion of the world, WBC bantamweight champion of the world. Albert Davila, on the other hand, was not a big puncher. He was a very skilled technician, could score stoppages if he needed to, but he was more or less a good workman. He had failed in 4 attempts at the bantamweight title. He had lost to Carlos Zarate. He had lost to Jorge Lujan. He had lost to Lupe Pintor. And I'm forgetting another one that he had challenged and lost. Basically, he had failed 4 times. I don't know if he fought I don't think he fought Jeff Chandler, but 4 times he had failed in attempt. This was going to be his 5th and final time. They touched gloves for the 12th round, and Albert Davila opened up a can of whoop ass on Bejinas, finally sending him to the canvas midway through the 15th round. And Bejinas, you could tell something was wrong with him, because as he turned to try to get up from his knees, his feet were crossed as he was facing the canvas. He didn't beat the count. He didn't regain consciousness. He also died of a brain trauma days after the fight. Changing the fight from 15 to 12 rounds wouldn't have saved his life either. And I say this with a sort of crass, because the people who think they know better, kind of like our politicians here in the United States, think that they can change something and make themselves feel good about it. And I want to stress this to you, because I don't want to get too political on this show, because we've been suffering over the last 2 years in the United States some serious political divide. There's a difference between doing good and feeling good. Changing the 15-round fights to 12 rounds makes people feel good. It hasn't stopped people from dying in combat sports. This is the fallout where we are suffering from now, is that the people who it made feel good are not bringing back Jimmy Robertson, who died as a result of his fight with Gabriel Ellis in an 11th round stoppage. Gerald McClellan, who suffered traumatic brain injuries against Nigel Bennett in a 12-round fight, is still not going to be made whole. This has been happening because these are combat sports. No changing of the distance of the fight is going to change any of that. And I just would like to address that again. This fight between Mancini and Kim was so strained and so glorious before it ended in tragedy that we don't see this kind of thing anymore. And what is really happening is, since boxing has become so commercialized and it's been taken off of network TV and the global money has gone into it, we don't see these guys sell out like they used to sell out. And call me nostalgic, which I've been blamed for being since I was when this fight was happening, in being nostalgic about baseball, being nostalgic about hockey, being nostalgic about anything, is that I hope that someday some organization or some people who know better, whether they're IT people or they're athletic people, can get together and form an organization that uses computer rankings. It doesn't require people to pay them to rank their fighters, like the IBC does with doing the computer rankings, and basically start an organization that sanctions 15-round title fights. And all those belts that are out there that people are paying sanctioning fees for would be meaningless. And then maybe we get the sport back to where it belongs. But again, this day in boxing, November 13th, 1982, was the day that changed the sport forever. I should have my regular stuff done tomorrow or sometime in the middle of the week, reviewing last week's fights but remember, this was one of the saddest days in boxing. Thanks, everybody.